Hello, and welcome back to the Games Institute podcast. I'm your host, Marisa Benjamin.
And I'm your host, Hobin Rossico.
Great. I was worried that you'd say co-host again. So we are here today with the very fabulous Nicholas Hobin.
A pleasure to be here.
And if anybody is watching the YouTube version of this, you might notice that our cameras are off today, and you'll have to be patient with us. We would like to remind you that it is still, in fact, the COVID-19 pandemic, especially here in Ontario where we're in lockdown. And we are just very excited to have Nicholas in whichever form he's willing to talk to us. So, Nicholas, why don't we kick you off with an icebreaker question?
Yes.
Can you please tell us, what is your earliest childhood memory of playing games?
My earliest childhood memory of playing games. Oh, that's actually very difficult. My family's always very much enjoyed games. We've always been a very playful group, and so if you wanted to press me to say, like, for example, what my earliest experience with digital games was, then I could point you towards a computer game that I rather enjoyed playing. I can't remember the name of it now, but it was about teaching kids about Leonardo da Vinci. And so the game involved you're in this kind of fortress, and you had to travel around and open doors and solve puzzles, all of which were related in some ways to inventions that Leonardo da Vinci had come up with.
That sounds really cool.
I still have fond memories of it. It was very enjoyable.
Oh, you know what the funny thing is about us having our cameras off is that Tobin and I can't take cues from each other about who's going to dive in with the follow-up.
Yeah, I was like, okay, how do we do this again? I don't remember.
I know. Why don't we? Here's a little behind-the-scenes action for everybody listening and for you, Nicholas. Tobin, why don't we just alternate?
Okay, sure.
Okay. So this one's all you.
This is gonna be very scripted. Episode's gonna be very scripted. All right. So Nicholas, I know you as a PhD student, and I'm somewhat familiar with your PhD research, but let's jump back to where this all began with undergrad, because we always like tracing the threads from kind of undergrad and how interests in gaming start to kind of peek through and eventually find their way out of the soil. So let's go back to undergrad and then walk us through all of that to where you are now, and let's see how it all makes sense.
Oh, okay. So with undergrad, when I actually started university in general, my interest wasn't in game studies yet. My interest was more in terms of theater and Shakespeare, Shakespeare particularly. When I was in undergrad, I was a member of I did my undergrad at King's University College in London, Ontario.
Okay, cool.
And I was a member of the group called the King's Players, which was sort of an amateur theater group. Calling it that, though, almost seems to kind of limit it too much, because we did like improv, we did games, we did you call it. As we were leaving, we started doing musicals and little short comedic plays. And it was a very, very playful environment, very fun. It's just like lots of different people just recreating themselves in all these different ways. I went when I was exploring possibilities for a master's, because my family is a family of teachers. We all have a very fond idea of academia and just the experience of learning. And so I always kind of felt drawn towards continuing my education after undergrad. And when I was looking for places to go to, in particular, I was looking for, Shakespeare-related places to go to. My attention got drawn to Waterloo, and it actually got drawn by my uncle, Ted McGee, who formerly taught Shakespeare at St. Jerome's College here.
Okay, cool.
So I came here with that in mind, and a lot of the kind of the things that I pursued ended up they were aimed in that direction towards Shakespeare, towards kind of the magic of Shakespeare in particular, that kind of thing. And I fell into game studies and animal studies almost by accident. What actually happened was that the very last course that I took as part of my master's was a game studies course taught by Neil Randall.
There you go. Yeah, you're doomed. It's all over.
Yeah, at that point in time, I knew
like
it was
the
going to
same
happen.
as me.
Yeah, I have to imagine he ends up recruiting a lot of students. It was a lot of it was I can't remember the exact name of the course, but it was the one where we played Lord of the Rings online, and that was Lord of the Rings and its adaptations were the primary subject of the course, and that was a lot of fun. And I had already met other people who were interested in video games and comic books and all of these other fields of media, creative and enjoyable media that I didn't encounter a lot of previously at King's and Western.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was really just I encountered, I did this game studies class just as I was leaving. I decided I was going to continue with my PhD because it was, hey, I was still having a lot of fun with it. And actually, what I decided to come back to Waterloo. I can't actually remember what my reasoning was now, other than that it was still a lot of fun. I think actually, no, you know what it was? Is because at that point in time, after Neil Randall's class, that's when I started really getting interested in game studies.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out that Waterloo is a very good place to study game studies, in no small part because of Neil Randall and all of his efforts and the Games Institute that he chairs or directs, I guess. So my what do you call it? My interest was sliding in that direction at that point in time, but I was still kind of in the in Shakespeare and theater mode.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what happened then? The very last course I took as part of my coursework for the PhD the course was just called Animal Studies, taught by Dr. Alice Kuzniar.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and really, I took it because I had a space I wanted to fill. And whenever that happens, my feeling at the time was, well, I'll just take something that looks like it's in a field that I haven't explored yet, because it might be something that I'll be able to take with me onwards. And it was an interesting course. I rather much enjoyed it. I very much enjoyed the professor. As for my final project in that class, I just thought, okay, we've talked a lot in this course about movies and books and all these other things, movies and art and all these different kinds of animal representations. We haven't talked about video games, which kind of surprised me. Let's see what's out there being said about it. And at least in the short amount of time I had to work with that project, I could not find anything that was being said about animal studies about video games in animal studies. As far as I could see, the two just did not overlap at all. And I distinctly remember thinking to myself, wow, there's a pretty big niche here. I could probably do a dissertation on this. No, I don't think I really want to do that because at the time it involved a lot of philosophers that I was not actually familiar with and I didn't want to have to go back to. I have now written extensively about those philosophers that I didn't want to go back to. They turned out to be annoyingly useful. Later, very shortly after that experience, as it turned out, the next part of the program at that point in time was for me to do a proposal for my dissertation. And on the whole Shakespeare and video games angle, I was just stuck, complete writer's block, could not think of a thing. And so after agonizing over that for a little bit, the memory of this kind of project and the big gap that I had seemed to have fallen into crept back into my memory. I was just like, okay, let's see what we can do with this. And I wrote what turned out to be a really good proposal. Like it just struck me as being so interesting. I still, all these years later, I still find it really, really interesting. Which it's not, I think, an experience that every PhD student has with their dissertation work. But yeah, it just clicked for me. It seemed to be at the time they had found a little bit of a niche, and it still seems to me that I'm kind of occupying a little bit of a niche with this, because I've met plenty of people who have been doing game studies at the university, and plenty of people who have been doing animal studies, but they, for the most part, they are in their own separate groups. As far as I know, I'm the only person who's focused on game studies, who's been at the Games Institute as long as I have.
Do you remember what your project, like the one in animal studies, was? And do you use that in your dissertation? Have you kind of adopted it over a little bit?
I do, yeah. It's obvious. It's blown up an awful lot since then. But it wasn't very it wasn't very complex at the beginning, because it didn't need to be. The question that I started off with was just, are people in animal studies talking about video games?
Oh, okay.
Oh.
The answer was not a lot.
Yeah.
And then my follow-up the question to that was, should they be talking about video games? And of course, the answer was, yeah, probably. Because of course, because video games are useful, as it turns out, for talking about all kinds of cultural issues.
That's such a good story. I'm sitting here thinking about the connection between Shakespeare and games. I'm trying to get inside your head, and honestly, I can't make it make sense unless I think about some of the other people that we know who are at the Games Institute studying game studies.
Mm-hmm.
And they seem to have origins in sort of earlier literature too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like Sabrina, she was initially drawn to English to study, I think, the Romantics or maybe Victorian literature.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's Michael Hancock who was originally really passionate about like early literature too. So maybe there is a connection there. Neil, right? Neil
Yeah.
is very
Absolutely, yeah.
so maybe it's just something that I can't quite wrap my head around because I just simply don't have that brain.
I think a lot of literature and a lot of gameplay, it comes back to kind of like this fundamental human need to tell stories. Like, human beings just love telling stories, and it underwrites a lot of the kind of things we do to enjoy ourselves. And I don't know how intuitive it is to all the time or to everybody, but I don't think it's very difficult to slip from looking at some other kind of storytelling into games or vice versa. I think they're very closely connected on some levels.
That does make sense, and I think that resolves the phenomenon. I'm also thinking about Lindsay Meaning, who's going to be on the podcast this month too, and she is very much driven by narrative. And the authors that she loves are very like people in my mind who are similar to Shakespeare, similar to Tolkien, like Terry Pratchett, who are very narrative dense writers.
Yes.
Yeah, and this is really great because actually coming up this weekend is the International Games and Narrative Conference, the first of its kind.
Absolutely.
So what a better way to be talking about this connection.
Yes, that's absolutely true. Lindsay and I are both part of the narrative group, the discussion group, actually, that helped to kind of throw that conference together.
Awesome.
So we're all very tremendously excited about it.
Oh, thank you for doing that. I'm very much looking forward to sitting in on a lot of those talks.
Oh, absolutely. Well, we look forward to having you. I say we, of course, I'm going to be sitting in on most of those talks myself. So I think that I'll be as much in the audience as I am anywhere else.
Well, so you already addressed when you realized you could blend your love of games with your research. So now let's talk a little bit more about what your research currently looks like. So you started off trying to figure out how to address this niche of connecting animal studies with game studies. But where has that taken you now, 4 years later?
It has taken me to many places. I think in part because I think I started with a very, I also want to say baseline question. So the basic idea that I started with in the proposal that I proposed originally was just, okay, we've got field A and we've got field B. What happens if we just take these two fields and squish them together a little bit? Will useful scholarship fall out of it? And useful scholarship has not stopped falling out of it. It's been kind of ridiculous. And so one of the big challenges for me in my writing and my research has been to kind of to try to keep to a single focused trajectory the entire time, because it can take you either of these fields, animal studies or game studies, can take you off in all these different directions. So I think we started out just by asking what it seems to me to be very basic, simple, obvious questions. But of course, those are really the most valuable ones, the ones that you can really build a foundation of things on, such as what do people, or how, I should say, how do people think about animals? And how do are video games useful for exploring this kind of subject? And of course, they are absolutely useful for exploring this kind of subject as much as art, as much as cinema. And it's useful in the same way that art and of course, I mean visual art and cinema are, because video games have their own particular kinds of affordances and their own particular kinds of characteristics, which are not, I don't want to say that they're not shared with other media, but they're expressed in a distinctive way. So it's like they share things with cinema, and they share things with theater, and they share things with visual art, but they all kind of come at the same time. We would not mistake a video game for being theater or cinema or visual art. It's its own thing somehow, and so it ends up expressing itself, expressing its characteristics, expressing the things that went into it in a different way than any of these other media do. And so in that way, because it does these things, video games potentially have the ability to kind of, oh, sorry, but the thought I'm finding actually difficult to express, but it's like if all media, our media express things about ourselves. And if video games are a unique medium, then they have a way of expressing things about ourselves in a unique way, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Yeah. That's very huge. I can imagine how challenging it is to explain that without just reciting, actual research you had to do.
Yeah, as long as I've done this, I would think by now I'd be a little bit better at it, but it still seems just so big, which I guess it is big.
I think once you're able to define it in concise terms, that's when it stops being so interesting to you.
That's fair. That's fair.
So as you go about your research and you are working with different scholars and theories and stuff, what games are you actually playing to examine these concepts from the video games themselves?
Well, the first thing that I did starting out was I realized that I was going to have to narrow down the kinds of gameplay, the kinds of games, pardon me, that I looked at, because animals and animal imagery are everywhere, absolutely everywhere. And I talk about video games as if it's like a single distinctive thing, but no, it's just like it's uncountable genres kind of smushed together into this one sort of medium. So I needed to find some way to put barriers down somewhere. So what I decided was that in the same way that when we look at a human being in a game and kind of imagine that this is like a real person being projected into it, I decided that I was only going to look at quote unquote real life animals, like real animals that are being reflected in the game somehow. And so that meant that I was going to try to avoid anthropomorphic animals, so like Donkey Kong, Sonic the Hedgehog, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Like the feeling that I left with from Dr. Kazniar's first class was when I was looking at this kind of thing, it was really more of a human wearing an animal suit, as it were. It was reflecting something about humans, but not necessarily about the animals that it was imitating.
Yeah.
I decided also that I was going to try to avoid monsters, so things that had animal characteristics but were not animals themselves. And so this would cut out like Pokemon and that kind of thing. Because again, these are things that they're telling us stories about animality, animalishness, but not animals. If that distinction makes any sense.
Interesting to think about.
And then the final thing that I wanted to kind of cut out was what I tend in my head to think of as fairy tale animals, by which I mean to say animals that use human faculties, animals that use human language.
Oh,
for example.
Okay.
I can't actually, oddly enough, right off the top of my head, I can't actually think of any video game examples of that. The first thing that comes to mind is like the Cheshire Cat from Alice in Wonderland. But I know that they do pop up in games now and again, and I wanted to kind of shy away from those, at least at first, because again, that's it comes down to that. I want to talk about real animals, or how we think about real animals, and not how we project animal things onto human beings. I hope that makes sense. So that was kind of where I drew the lines. In that first project that I did in Dr. Kazniar's class, I looked at Red Dead Redemption.
Yes.
which I was playing through at the time, and that still ended up being a tremendously useful game to explore. Later on, I ended up looking at sequel when it came out. What other ones have I looked at? I've looked at the Far Cry series. I've looked at for some reason my brain's blanking on me, but I know I've looked at
pull up the notes.
I've looked at Stardew Valley.
Yes. Stardew Valley. I've heard you talk about Horizon Zero Dawn, and most recently Untitled Goose Game.
Yes. Oh, Untitled Goose Game. Yeah, I forgot you were doing research about that.
Horizon Zero Dawn actually was a funny one because I was very hesitant to do it at first, because it came down to that whole, I want to talk about animals, not monsters. And the animals in Horizon Zero Dawn, for the most part, are not actually animals. Like they're literally not flesh and blood animals. They're machines in animal shape. And I was just like, I think this might fall outside of that kind of dividing line for myself. But as I explored it a little bit, it just ended up being so incredibly useful that I just had to dive into it a little bit more deeper. So it's made it into the dissertation.
When you say that it was incredibly useful, what do you mean? Because I'm thinking about Horizon Zero Dawn. For anybody who hasn't played it, it's an absolutely stunning open world game, and there are animals in the background, but the more prominent animals that Nicholas is talking about, I believe, are like the cyber, like robotic animals. So it's robots, but they remind me of buffalo, I think.
There's a large number of different kinds of them. So there's robots that look like deer or antelope, and robots that look like tigers or wolves, and robots that look like dinosaurs, because like we had to have dinosaurs somewhere there. It would be a poor game otherwise. A funny thing actually about this particular subject is that I did and Marissa, you'll remember this because you moderated it, but there was a conversation that we had between me and a couple of other scholars at the Games Institute, which I think is probably on the Games Institute YouTube channel right now. And we talked about this a little bit. Tremendously fascinating discussion. I loved it. So the way that that particular game goes is that all the large forms of animal life within the game have been replaced by these robot machines. And they've kind of filled in the space they filled in the space that animals used to occupy. And that is both in a physical sense, like you will actually go out into the wild and encounter these machines instead of the animals you might in other games, but also in a kind of a cultural sense, because humans have a very, in real life, animals are a very important part of just about every human culture that you can imagine. It's John Berger in one wrote an essay, chapter, book. I'm not actually sure the right term to use. He wrote something called Looking at Animals, I think it's called. My mind's blanking, but John Berger, I'm correct about that is his actual name. And he talked about how the first human metaphors were probably animals. The first human artwork might have been painted with animal blood as pigment. So animals have always been an essential part of our imagination. And within the imaginary world of Horizon Zero Dawn, these animal machines have kind of taken that place. So the cultures within the game use animal parts to decorate themselves and their homes and their cities. They have mythologies explaining where the machines came from, and why animals and machines can't communicate the way humans can communicate with each other, and all these things that in real life exist around animal life, non-human animal life. Within the game, the machine kind of fills this cultural and psychological niche.
That's fascinating.
I have a follow-up.
Yes.
Okay, so I took Dr. Kuzniar's Freud class.
Ooh.
And a part of that was about pets.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe Freud had whippets, or some prominent person in that era had whippets, and they wrote about them a lot. And so what we talked about there was kind of how pets or animals, when they're in the pet role, is, they kind of fill in for family members, and it's this extension, and you mourn their death the same way that you would mourn a mother or a father or sister or brother or whatever. But my understanding of the games that you mentioned that you're researching, for the most part, like Red Dead and Far Cry and that kind of stuff, and even Horizon, the animals are assets that you need to go and kill and collect some portion of them. And so they're less about pets and more of a resource or part of some kind of economy to be able to upgrade to make yourself stronger. So, like, when you play these games, what specifically are you looking at, and how the animal, like what roles the animals fill, from like a narrative standpoint, or are you looking at them from a gameplay standpoint, or like a mechanic standpoint, right? Is that kind of like collectibleness kind of a thing?
I look at both to a degree. I'm looking at where the animal kind of fits into the, I want to call it the narrative, although that might be a little bit precise, but like the story of that the game is creating, the image of the world that the game is trying to represent. So, and I do also try to look at the mechanics, the ways in which the player is able to engage with the animals. And you're absolutely right. I think it's not a stretch to say that within any game, because of the space, like the actual space for information within each game is limited, and designers are going to have to make choices about what to include or not within each game, then anything that makes it into a game will be important to the player in some way. Anything that exists within the game world exists primarily because it impacts me, the person playing the game, in some way, shape, or form.
I like that.
And so when you see animals within games, there's this inescapable utilitarianism to them, I guess. They have a purpose in some way, shape, or form. So animals tend to be tools or ornamentation or enemies. So they're there to if you are playing a game and you see, for example, blue sky and trees, you'll probably hear the sound effects of birds somewhere, even if like birds themselves do not actually exist.
Wow.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. I'm just really loving hearing you explain all of this. pretty familiar with your research in some ways by now because we've worked together quite a bit. But every time we talk, I just learn something new and my mind gets blown all over again.
Well, thank you.
Because, talking about how the game itself is leveraging animals to create a more cohesive experience for the player is something that's, I think, within and outside of the story. Because the way that I've thought about it before from talking to you is that there's animals in there that are meant to be used, right, like in Horizon Zero Dawn, how you can harvest certain things and add to your stack. Yeah. But then thinking about how also animals are used to create the ambiance, right? Like a rustling field and grass and then a bunny hopping through changes your situational awareness. And you think like, okay, this setting is not where an enemy is going to appear, at least not yet.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, now that we're talking about what you're paying attention to in your research, can you actually describe a little bit more about your research process?
My research process?
Yeah, I've seen you do your research. It looks like you sitting and playing a game or you reading something, but there's actually a ton more that's happening, right?
Yeah.
So what are you thinking about while you're actually doing your research into a game?
In the very early stages, not an awful lot. My research at the beginning is at least my research is tends to be very. I tend to think of it as serendipitous. So my first steps are basically I began by doing. Calling it a survey is a little bit too generous but I was looking for examples of games and animals. Pardon me, exactly the opposite. Animals and games, trying to see what kinds of generalizations I could make about them. And while I was doing that, I was also trying to build my expertise about animal studies, basically the field, the kinds of discussions that were happening. And yeah, the kinds of ideas that were being explored. It seems like I'm not doing a lot of work if I say that I just kind of waited for things to fall into my lap. But at the very beginning, I found that was exactly what was happening, because there was that the field was so rich in ideas that I could explore. I could it was basically I would be reading an author, and then I would basically just take this author, move it over to the games they've been playing, and think about, okay, what this person talking about? Does it tell me something about the way that the animals are working in this thing over here? Does it make? Is it able, by applying this to that? Am I able to realize something about that I wasn't previously? And if particularly early on, it really did. It was very rich, is what I found.
That's such a cool opportunity for you. And earlier when you were talking about how you had to limit the scope of which games you were investigating, I couldn't help but think about how that's also creating space for scholars to come later and take up those topics. And there's so much space here for so many people to come in.
Absolutely.
Continue the work. And I also just want to say, before I let Tobin ask you the next question, just how much of a pleasure it is to get to see you do your work.
Thank you.
I'm looking forward to going back into the Games Institute so that can continue to happen, hopefully. But we always, on tours, when we're explaining how our labs are used by people in different fields, we say, somebody in psychology or human computer interaction might book this lab in order to run participant studies, or we might see a game studies student for example, Nicholas Hobin, come in and use this lab to do his personal research, which requires like sitting with a game and investigating it.
So what I would be curious to see is have Marisa recount an experience from our early D&D campaign where no matter what was killed, something had to be harvested, some kind of token. And often cases these were monsters, or no, in most cases they were animals, because that's what you fight as a low-level D&D character. And then have Nicholas give some kind of analysis of what was going on in the characters' minds and how they thought all of this stuff was going to be so useful, even though nothing turned out to be useful. But I don't think we have enough time for that. So, let's see. So, when you're doing this research, like, what is your end goal? Obviously, you want to finish a dissertation and go on. But is this something that you would want to see like applied to more classes, right? Like if you went back to an animal studies, would it be animal/game studies course? Is it to help game designers find more meaningful ways to include animals? Like what is your
Or ethics?
objective? Pardon me?
Like, is it like an ethics course too?
Yeah.
I think when I think about the kinds of people I want to benefit from my work, I think my immediate thought is actually for people like myself, people coming from the humanities, who just who don't realize that this big unexplored space is there. I would like other people to kind of take up and explore some of these subjects, and I do think that's happening to a degree. I think those scholars are definitely out there, but it seems to me that they're few and far between. Like, as I say, to my knowledge, I haven't met anybody who's explored this subject to the same degree that I have at Waterloo at this point in time. In terms of what I want out of it, I think having a course that overlaps game studies and animal studies would be fantastic, and I would love to see that.
I would love to see that.
That would be so much fun. For me, in terms of ethics, I don't know that I've drawn a lot of ethical conclusions yet. I don't think that I've taken I've kind of been cautious about. I haven't yet stretched what I've been exploring as far as to say that this teaches us about how we should treat animals. Maybe I'm being actually a little bit precise over there. I probably do have some things to say about that.
Yeah, I want to follow up on that, and I won't make you actually draw any conclusions if that's not something that's within what you want to do. But when I was watching your presentation about Untitled Goose Game that you presented at the Canadian Game Studies Association conference last week, I thought that you were making some really important observations there that got into the territory of like how we think about our domesticated animal relatives and also just animals' relation to the land, sharing the land with us. So yeah, can you maybe dive into a little bit of what you were doing with Untitled Goose Game and what you were saying for the listeners?
This connects actually a little bit back towards what Tobin mentioned about pets earlier on, which I think is handy. So the way that Untitled Goose Game works is that the tagline for the game is, "It is a beautiful day and you are a horrible goose." And so the way that the game works is that you are a goose set in the middle of a quaint little village, and your object is to run around and annoy as many people as possible. You have each little area in the village has a small list of ways in which you can annoy the people. If you complete enough of the tasks on the list, eventually somebody will come along and post a "No Goose Allowed Here" sign, inevitably in the process accidentally opening a path for you to travel to another area of the village and start the process all over again. When I was playing it, I was we at the, I mentioned this in the CGSA presentation, but we at the University of Waterloo have kind of a complex and ongoing relationship with our geese because the campus sits on a permanent Canadian goose nesting ground.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have to, we and the geese have to tolerate each other an awful lot.
Yeah, and it's a rite of passage.
Exactly,
to be honked at and or attacked by a goose at some point.
In the process of researching this presentation, I found a news article from a while past about a goose that was nicknamed the son of Satan. Apparently terrorized the residents for a little while. But because of this history, I was kind of curious and wondering why the designers chose not to have they chose not to use a Canada goose basically as the protagonist. As the player character. I wondered why that was, because when I think of goose and pest, I immediately go to Canada goose. And that just a little bit of, I want to call it research, but it was really just poking around on Wikipedia for a few minutes, and I found out that the exact species of goose that you were playing in this game was a domestic goose. So it was a domesticated species. And that kind of changed the entire relationship of the goose to everything else to me. Because when we think about domesticated species, we tend to kind of slot them into particular roles. Human beings have kind of like a social order into which domesticated animals fit. Mm. They have a purpose. They have spaces that we allow them into. They have ways in which we expect them to behave, and we kind of discourage them in one way or another from acting or moving outside of those particular boundaries. And taking that particular thought, and then you move it on to this particular game where all of these people are trying really, really hard either to corral this particular goose or at least to ignore it, to pretend things are normal. So you'll be running around grabbing gardening implements and throwing them in the river and stealing shoes off of people's feet and putting on bows that you find lying around. And they're trying to get you to not do that, basically, to stay out, to disrupt their space. They're trying to minimize the disruption you cause to their space. But you, as the goose, will not do that. So it's this curious kind of relationship I found in which the goose has a role that is expected to play within this human environment by virtue of being a domesticated species. And the gameplay, the fun of the gameplay, comes from recognizing that they want you to put you into this role and not going along with what they want.
There's something to this that I think is important to say, even though it is constituted as a spoiler. But it's just so important that I think we shouldn't care. So here's the spoiler alert for Untitled Goose Game. Nicholas, in your talk, you were saying how at the end, the culminating task is to...
The very last task that you have to do is you go into this little miniature village where you can stomp around Godzilla like for a while, and then you steal a golden bell from the top of a kind of a replica of a bell tower that you've heard throughout the entire game but have never seen. And then the last task is to carry it all the way back to the beginning of the game to the meadow where you started, where you drop it into a pit that has always been there, but you've never had reason to look for before. And the pit, at the bottom of the pit, is a pile of other golden bells that apparently you have stolen previously. This figuring out the goose's species, this was another kind of revelatory moment for me, because it kind of it changed what the narrative was for me. It wasn't just this. It wasn't just this case that a goose had shown up one day and everybody was just kind of waiting until it got bored or hungry and moved on. This goose has been there for a while. This kind of the story that you've gone through in the game, in which the villagers try to kind of impose an order on the space, and the goose comes along and disrupts it. This has been going on and on and on interminably. I got to use in the presentation. I got to use the word Sisyphean, and I was very pleased about that because I don't often have reason to be able to use that.
It's so fitting.
But that's exactly what's happening on the part of the villagers. There's this it's this constant struggle for them to kind of erect. They are constantly fixing their signs and replacing the items that are knocked over, and altogether just trying to enact an order in the space in which they live. And then inevitably the goose comes through and does the whole thing over again.
Yeah, I thought by Sisyphean, which is, if anybody doesn't know, Sisyphus pushing the giant world up the mountain or something. I thought you meant the goose was doing that.
So I think the exact myth is that I can't remember what he's being punished for exactly, but the idea is that Sisyphus has, as punishment for something, Sisyphus has to push a rock to the top of a hill in the underworld, and every time he makes it to the top, the rock slips out of his grasp and falls down again. So he has to do this over and over and over.
Right. I was bungling it with Atlas holding the world, but we got there. But yeah, so I thought you meant that the goose was the Sisyphus figure, because his effort, like the goose's effort, I'm projecting a gender. Their effort is about, I don't know, like reclaiming some of their agency in this world that's not meant for them, and then just to have it overwritten.
I think they both the goose and the villagers seem to be kind of locked into this cycle together.
Oh, yeah.
But I think if I would paint the villagers though as being a little bit more Sisyphean, and I think the goose is more successful. Though you call it the goose's goal, such as it is into kind of take the boundaries that these people have erected around their space and poke holes in it. And the village. Oh, sorry.
Okay, sorry. Continue. But I am going to follow up with a debating question.
Okay, sure. And I was just to finish up the villagers seem to be constantly trying to again reassert themselves over the space, and judging by this big pile of bells that you discover at the end, they have constantly been failing to do this. They're still doing it.
I love this.
Mm-hmm.
But here's my debating thing.
Yes.
What if the goose is trying to just get rid of this bell, because the noise of the bell, if you can hear it throughout the entire game, maybe the noise of the bell is really annoying to this goose or really disruptive. And so the goose has to go through all of these different spaces in order to get to this place and find the bell and bring it home and get rid of it so that the humans can't use it anymore. And every time they complete this task, they find out that the bell just gets replaced and they have to go through it all over again.
I think considering that reading a little bit, because there is something to it in that the goose is constantly kind of destabilizing the villagers' kind of control over their own space. It's it's kind of difficult to say that it's ever really able to assert its own in the same way.
Yeah.
It is kind of. I feel that it's kind of I think that the game my impression anyway, and others might have a different impression, is that it gives a kind of there's a bit more of an optimism to the goose's experience than there is to the humans. There is the sense that, and in part because there's some truth to this, because of course a goose is actually us, the players. But as the goose, the sense is that the village is here for our enjoyment.
Oh, interesting. I'm not arguing for simply because I think that that's correct. Because I think that your reading is almost definitely more correct, especially given the fact that the creators of the game called it a horrible goose, right? So that's reinforcing how we're supposed to experience the goose. But I have this alternative idea or impression of the goose only because you made me think about it when you're talking about the Canadian geese at Waterloo, right? Like the stereotype for us, or I guess like the common thing that students say is that the geese are so annoying and, we're stepping on their poop, we're getting attacked by them, how horrible.
Yes.
But really, like, we humans have made it so that they have to be there, right? We kind of push them off of other spaces where they could have lived. And also because of the way that we designed the university, we made it like a safe haven for the geese because they're sort of protected by predators like coyotes and such. So I think because of the way that you were presenting your ideas, you had me start thinking about how these narratives and stories get developed in a way that even when we are the player character, the animal, it's still an anthropocentric viewpoint.
Yes, and I think I don't think this is a kind of a thought that I'm still kind of mulling over, but I don't think that you can create. I don't think that you're likely to ever experience a non-anthropocentric viewpoint from a video game, or at least not a video game that's made to be sold. Because there is that kind of pressure, unfortunately, with video games, is that they need to make money. There's a business element, the capitalistic business behind it, and so unless you're like an indie developer doing like a labor of love, you're going to want to create something that people will enjoy and people will play. And so there's always going to be kind of an anthropocentric element to it, just as a result of that. Also, more generally, just by virtue of the fact that we are human beings, we can't. I don't think that we're ever able to really meet the animal on its own terms without that perspective.
Yeah.
There's two dimensions to that. The first being that it's like we're human beings. By default, we see everything from a human perspective. We literally cannot help ourselves with that. So that's one dimension of it. And the other dimension being that as human beings, we have infiltrated the world in every way. There is not a corner of the planet that has remained unaffected by us at this point in time. And so we can't really kind of, so the idea of human and animal space overlapping that is the reality of how things are. Unfortunately, that is how it's always been and how it always will be. Where kind of the interesting thing about the game, or the virtue of this particular game, is that so many human narratives and human cognitions about animals, they imagine the world as being an orderly place with human beings on top of it, into which animals fit somehow. And even objective ones that strive for objectivity, even scientific objectivity, will sometimes make the mistake of imagining that animals are as a solved problem. The idea that we can understand them in their entirety, we can control them, even we can fit them into what we know. A lot of animal studies kind of begins with the suspicion or the understanding that we can't really understand animals in their entirety. We can imagine what it's like to be animals. We can imagine what their subjectivity is like, but we can't experience. It's always going to be just a little bit alien to us. We can't experience it the way that we can experience our own. And so they're never really going to be solved completely. And I think Goose Game kind of, in particular, maybe even not on its own, but certainly when you compare it to other animal narratives that you find in other animal games, it challenges that idea that the animal just kind of fits into the slot that's been allotted to it.
Wow. Yeah, I could go on about this for hours, but I think we are actually near the end of the episode. And what we have left for you is our closing question.
All right. Well, before we do that, I do want to know, what games are you playing for fun?
What games am I playing for fun? Well,
Maybe this will be a good primer for the last question.
Yeah. Recently, actually, Untitled Goose Game has been the most recent one. I've very recently delved into Skyrim for the first time.
Wow.
Because I figured I should get caught up on that at some point. Those are the ones I've been really occupying my attention. But I do tend to, particularly when playing for fun, I do tend to jump around a little bit. I'm playing a D&D game with a group of friends too.
Excellent. Very cool.
I
That
thought you'd
probably
approve
gives you a
that,
good
Toby.
break. Yeah, that probably gives you a good break from, video games, which have very much become part of your work.
It also kind of reaches back to that whole theater and storytelling thing that I started with.
Yeah, I was just thinking that. I was like, man, I bet Nicholas would be really fun to DM for.
Oh, if you have a space in a game sometime, let me know.
Let's make that happen.
Let's do that.
Do another Games Institute one shot.
We have to be careful not to promise anything on the podcast itself, but yeah, I would be totally into that.
So informally, we will explore the possibility space.
Yeah. Whenever I talk about D&D anymore, it's all just wishful thinking because it just never happens anymore.
Yeah, the biggest enemy of D&D is real life.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And pandemics. Yeah.
Yeah, that too.
All right. So, to really stump you, if you could have anyone in the world play one game, what would it be? What would be your number one recommendation?
Everyone in the world.
Everyone has to play this game.
Everyone in the world play one game. Oh, that is tricky. But I think I might actually say, but the first that comes to mind would be Horizon Zero Dawn. And that's, I think all the games I've played are kind of rich in terms of the kinds of things that you can pull out of them. Horizon Zero Dawn has just been bursting with interesting things, though. There will never, I don't imagine that there will ever be enough time to talk about every neat thing about it, every idea that can come out of it.
Are you excited for the sequel then?
I am, yes.
On the horizon, haha.
I am looking forward to it very much.
Cool.
You're the second person, I think, to mention Horizon Zero Dawn, though you come at it from a very different perspective. But I believe Pam said Horizon Zero Dawn.
So,
we had her on. Yeah.
I think that's part of why I think I'd choose that one, because you can come at it from so many different directions.
Very cool. Well, I guess that's it. I guess that has to be it for now. Probably to be continued, right?
I certainly hope so.
Yeah, and just in case somebody missed it earlier on in this conversation, there is a lot of space here to jump into this field. I mean, I think it was mentioned, one or two times. But yeah, if you're sitting there feeling inspired about animals and games and you want to dig into this work for yourself, you really should check out a lot of Nicholas Hobin's work, which is available online. And, look him up on Twitter, right? Is that where people can find you?
Unfortunately not. I don't have a Twitter account.
Uh-oh, I tagged somebody earlier today that might not have been
no.
Okay, it's possible that I have a Twitter account, but I've just forgotten about.
Oh, okay.
I
else
admit,
can people find you?
I'm very difficult to contact. Unfortunately, the easiest way, I'm actually an associate editor for First Person Scholar, which is the GI's graduate-led game studies publication. I believe my email is available through there. And that's probably the easiest way to get in contact with me.
Yeah, and then once you're in contact with Nicholas through the First Person Scholar, you should just write an article about what you want to research.
Absolutely do that. If you could write a game studies article, or sorry, they're all game studies articles. If you can write an animal studies article, there's always room to talk more about that.
There you go. All right. Thank you so much for joining us, Nicholas, and putting up with the technical difficulties.
It has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.